Welcome to Austen Mondays. I am your host, Edward G. Pettit from the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for 24 weeks, we're going on a biblio-venture with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In each episode, I talk with a special guest, a brilliant Austen scholar, creator, or Janeite about Austen and her works. And then I have an hour-long conversational annotation with a chapter co-host in which we illuminate, elucidate, explicate a few chapters of Pride and Prejudice. And our special guest today from Australia is Susannah Fullerton. Welcome, Susannah.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ed.
It's getting to be a habit for this show. Last week we had from Australia, Clara Toot, and this week you. So, and hopefully some more viewers from the other side of the world, which would be good. Thank you. More with Susannah in a moment, everyone. And stay tuned for our chapter annotation segment when Kathleen Hudson will join me to talk about chapters 48 to 50 or volume 3, chapters 6 to 8. And we're calling that Lydia and the Wickedest Young Man in the World. If you're watching live on YouTube right now, or if you're watching the recording on YouTube, I invite you to please like the video and also subscribe to the channel, Doing that gives our show greater visibility and leads to more people discovering Austen Mondays. And I want to welcome any new viewers, especially if you're from Australia or New Zealand or wherever you're from, but especially those places, because I know Susanna was spreading the word and 43 new registrations came in this weekend. So that was very nice. Thank you. Thank you for that, Susanna. Let's take a turn about the room. Susannah Fullerton has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for over 25 years. She is the author of Jane Austen and Crime, A Dance with Jane Austen, Happily Ever After, Celebrating Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Jane and I, A Tale of Austen Addiction. She speaks about Austen's life and works at conferences, libraries, schools, and for Jane Austen societies around the world, and now for Austen Mondays too. So thanks again for being here, Susannah. And let's get started right off the bat. The question I ask all of our guests, if you have an Austen discovery moment in your life.
Well, I guess my Austen discovery moment led to the first book that I wrote about Jane Austen. And it was all connected with the Jane Austen Society of Australia. And I was sitting on a bus travelling into the centre of Sydney. And I went past a wonderful old jail. It's a Georgian building. And of course, Sydney was a penal settlement. So it does have quite a few buildings connected with prisons and magistrates and things like that. And I started to wonder about the little tiny connections that Jane Austen had with crime. Now, I think most Jane Austen readers know that her aunt, Mrs. Lee Perrott, was in great danger of being transported to Botany Bay for shoplifting. She, in the end, didn't have to come out to this part of the world, but the Austen family must have at least thought about Australia and what sort of life would be waiting for their aunt there. The other connection is one that is less well known, and it connects with Jane Austen's favourite niece, Fanny Knight. She married a man called Sir Edward Knatchbull, and Sir Edward Knatchbull had a half-brother. So the connection is all getting quite tenuous here, but it's an interesting one. And that half-brother was called John Knatchbull, and he was something of a bad egg. He stole money, he got transported to Australia. Once out here, he proceeded to murder an elderly woman by smashing her head open with a hatchet. And as a result of that crime, he was condemned to be hanged. So the building that I was passing on the bus that day was the old Darlinghurst jail, and it was outside that jail on a lovely sunny morning in February 1844 that John Knatchbull was hanged in front of a crowd of 10,000 really interested Sydneysiders who all came out to watch this delightful entertainment. So that got me thinking, well, Jane Austen's only two little connections with Australia are both to do with crimes. And I thought maybe I could put together a talk for the Jane Austen Society of Australia about some of the crimes that feature in her fiction, particularly in her juvenilia, and that get mentioned in her letters. So I went away and I started researching, but the trouble was I kept coming up against big questions. If Lydia, an underage girl, elopes with Mr. Wickham in Pride and Prejudice, is she actually committing a crime in the eyes of the law?
We had these
When
questions last week.
Maria
Yeah.
Rushworth and Maria Bertram, who was, has an adulterous relationship with Henry Crawford, is that a crime? Where do thefts occur in her novels? And which of her characters, fascinatingly, actually commit hanging offences? And I came up with all these questions. What happened to a poacher? What about drinking tea that had been brought into the country by smugglers? All these different things. Was suicide a crime? We know that Marianne comes fairly close to suicide. She comments in the novel, "Had I died, it would have been self-destruction." So I felt that all of these questions needed answers, because Jane Austen's contemporary readers would all have known the answers to those questions. So I went away and researched, and instead of just giving a talk to the Jane Austen Society of Australia, I ended up producing my book, Jane Austen and Crime. And I had a lot of fun doing it. And I think that it sheds a light that, a lot of people think, well, Jane Austen's just about pretty ballrooms and drawing rooms and picnics. But there is a darker side to her novels, and I think it comes through in really interesting ways. For example, we know she visited a jail while she was writing Mansfield Park, and I think prison imagery comes very, very richly into that novel. So that was my first full book on Jane Austen. I have gone on to write more, but I think that really has to be my discovery moment, sitting on a bus and going past a prison.
What prison did Austen visit, and was it just? I mean, I
She
know people
visited the
visited.
one in She visited the one in Canterbury. She was staying with her brother Edward, and he was a magistrate, and he had to go to the prison as part of his duties as a magistrate. And Jane Austen went along with him, which was an unusual thing for a young lady of the Regency to be doing.
Yeah.
So I ended up writing to the prison to find out more about its history at the time of Jane Austen's visit. And I think it very definitely influenced the writing of Mansfield Park.
Interesting. How about, we had this question about Lydia too. Maybe you can chime in on that. And people were asking, well, is this criminal? And obviously, well, I'll ask you the question. Was it crime?
Lydia and Wickham are supposed to be going to Scotland. And
Mhm.
had they crossed the border and got married at Gretna Green or somewhere in Scotland, their marriage would have had to be accepted as legal. But any parson marrying them in England without parental permission, because Lydia is underage, could have been liable for 14 years transportation to Australia, just for doing the marriage ceremony. Now, of course, in the end, Mr. Gardner is there at the wedding giving Lydia away, and so there's not that problem. And really, there's not a lot that outraged parents like Mr. Bennet can actually do, because the girl's reputation is already ruined. And really, the best thing, as all the Bennets recognise, is to patch up a bad situation and get Wickham to actually marry Lydia.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Jane Austen was fascinated by elopements. And of course, we have another one in Mansfield Park with Julia Bertram and Mr. Yates. They actually get to Scotland. And I think she shows that elopements display a lack of moral worth and perhaps poor education, selfishness. Lydia is certainly very selfish indeed in the way she behaves over the whole elopement. Thinks only of herself and Wickham, and sends that incredibly tactless and typically Lydia letter talking about that great rent in her worked muslin gown, which I think is a very symbolic moment for what's happened to Lydia's virginity. So I think Jane Austen was really interested in elopements and uses them in fascinating ways, comic ways in the juvenilia, where a governess elopes with the butler and things like that happen, but in very moral ways within her mature fiction.
Mm-hmm. So then did this predate your involvement with the Jane Austen Society of Australia? Like, this was what brought you in?
No, I was already.
You were
In
already.
fact, I think at the time I started my book, I was probably the vice president, but no, I had been a member for a little while. And my first introduction to Jane Austen was, as with so many people, through my mother. I began with Pride and Prejudice. I think such a wonderful starting point for an Austen journey. My mother and my grandmother and my great-grandmother were all huge Jane Austen fans. So one day when I think I was 11 or 12, my mother said to me, I think you might be ready for some Jane Austen. And I lay along the end of her bed and she opened the book and she began, "It is a truth universally acknowledged."
That's nice.
And I think I was hooked from that moment. So
Wow.
I did get a bit frustrated because she kept stopping to laugh. I was still too young to appreciate the irony. And I just wanted to find out what was happening in the story. So I said, "Come on, Mum, stop laughing, keep reading." But, I've of course now know exactly where and why she laughed. And I think I was just so lucky to start my whole Austen journey with my mother. We could discuss the book, we could delight in it together. And of course, since then, I've reread Pride and Prejudice so many times.
Does the Australia Society operate much like the North American Society does?
On the whole, it does. It does have different groups, although it's perhaps less formally organised than JASNA is. But the group in Sydney is by far the biggest. We usually get about 150, 160 people coming to every meeting, and they're held every 2 months. We hold a wonderful conference every year. This year's conference is going to be on Sense and Sensibility, and it will be in Canberra, the national capital. We hold a special lunch at Christmas to celebrate Jane Austen's birthday and Christmas. And of course, that's midsummer for us. So it's a nice time of year to be out and about. We have an international Zoom lecture every year because we've got members in New Zealand and all over the country. So it's nice to give them a chance to be involved. And we publish wonderful publications. So we do have many overseas members who join just to get our journal, Sensibilities, and our fabulous newsletter, which is called Chronicle, or sort of journal. So we're a very, very busy, active society.
Yeah.
And, we're keeping the Jane Austen flag flying here at the other end of the world. So
I didn't know you also had a journal too, as the JASN does here.
Yes.
I didn't realize that.
The journal comes out twice a year along with Chronicle, and that has book reviews and scholarly articles and many of the talks given at our meetings. So yes, we're the biggest literary society in the whole country. So that's as it should be with Jane Austen.
As it should be with Jane Austen. You're right. So you also, I mean, I love the varied, kinds of books that you've written about Austen. I mean, did you go from crime to the book on dance, A Dance with Jane Austen?
This is quite a contrast. I was asked to write it, and of course I have always been fascinated by dance in the novels. It's so important in every single one of the books. It's there. And again, what I tried to do in that book was to fill in some of the social history. So, if Mr. Collins asks poor Elizabeth to dance and she turns him down, that means she has to sit out the rest of the evening. She cannot turn down one man and then go off and dance with another. So hence she has to say yes to Mr. Collins if she wants to enjoy the rest of the evening. And I really love the fact that the one and only use of the word ecstasy in Pride and Prejudice is the moment when poor Elizabeth is released from dancing with Mr. Collins. And we hear the moment of her release from him was ecstasy. So I love the fact that the only person who's connected with ecstasy in the novel is Mr. Collins.
And these dances
but I really tried to sort of fill in all the social details. A dance in those days could last as long as 30 minutes.
Yeah. So
if you're stuck with Mr. Collins, it's going to treading on your toes and getting the steps wrong. It is going to be a very long 30 minutes. and you're not going to have so many dances in the course of the evening that you can, as a young unmarried lady, waste opportunities to fix the interest of a man or get to know him better, work out if he's got bad breath or he smells or whatever it might be. So dancing was supremely important within courtship. So it was a lot of fun writing that book.
It makes it interesting that Darcy, with knowing the length of the dances, when Darcy's, or Elizabeth, is someone going to speak? Otherwise, we're just going to be silent for this inordinate, this long amount of time. I did notice this time, and something I hadn't noticed in the past, I don't think, is that do the dances all come in pairs? It's you ask somebody for 2 dances, and
yes, that's normal, and you shouldn't have more than 2 dances. So Jane and Bingley danced twice together at that first ball where they meet each other. Marianne and Willoughby, of course, dance far too much with each other in Sense and Sensibility, and they really break the rules of decorum. Yeah. So there were a lot of rules and regulations connected with the dancing, scene, and Jane Austen, as a keen dancer herself, was very much aware of them and reflects that in the novels.
She writes about the lots of dances that she's gone to herself and how much she enjoyed it. I also love how in the novels she's really using these dances to develop characters and the way they relate to each other, right?
Very much so. And I think, you can almost sort of pick up on the dance steps when Elizabeth and Darcy are dancing with each other. And, you get these little bits of dialogue in the turns of the dance. And it's almost as if the steps and the patterns of the dance are being reflected in the conversation. And as Elizabeth tries to sort of needle him a little bit, and he's growing more and more attracted, and they're toing and froing in the dance, just as they're toing and froing in their conversations. So it's a brilliant scene, that one. It's handled so skillfully by Jane Austen.
Yeah, I said 3. It's 3. Well, there's 2 forms. There's the Netherfield Ball. Before that, there's the assembly, and then there's a little house party that turns into a dance where Elizabeth gets to
I write in my book about the big difference between a private ball and a public ball. And of course, the first one, the Meryton Assembly, is a public ball, so pretty much anybody can go, whereas the Netherfield one is much more exclusive, and it's by invitation. So it's really interesting to observe the differences. And sometimes in the novel there are little informal hops. We hear in Mansfield Park that there's a violin playing servant in the servants' hall, so this gives them the excuse for a dance, and that turns out to be Fanny's first ball. And I think Jane Austen, she was so interested in selfishness, and I think she often uses dance to portray the selfishness of the characters. Those who don't obey the rules, who don't consider others. Think of the Iltons snubbing Harriet when she's without a partner. Wonderful Mr. Knightley steps in and rescues her. There's nothing selfish about Mr. Knightley. So she uses dance as a way of really depicting character, and particularly the faults of different characters.
But the dances themselves are the microcosm of the society around them, and this is how they behave here is how they behave outside of it. Interesting. The dances really go all night too. I frequently find that in Austen's works. It seems like they're up until the morning.
They go for a long time, and they were frequently held on nights of a full moon. So John Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility talks about, it's a full moon and everybody's busy. Because it made the roads safer for getting home. Your chances of meeting a highwayman, much as Catherine Morland would have liked to have encountered one, are much lessened on nights of full moon. It's just generally safer travelling on the roads when you have to get home. And I think Jane Austen, I've got a chapter in my book on transport to the dance, and Jane Austen herself so frequently had to wait for some kind neighbour or relative to offer her a lift. And on one occasion she gets 3 offers of lifts, and she says, oh, well, that means I would have been more at the ball than anybody else, as if 3 versions of her were going to go. But there were other times when it was a struggle to get there. And we hear in the Watsons, the unfinished novel, about the heroine, struggling to get to the ball. That is a lovely ball scene in that unfinished work. So it wasn't easy for a single woman. The Bennets have a carriage. They can send their daughters and Mrs. Bennet in the carriage, and they can all go home safely in the carriage. But for many others, getting to the ball was a real challenge. And if you lived in Bath, you would take maybe a sedan chair. You were at risk of being sometimes robbed or almost kidnapped by the sedan chair men, who could charge what they liked because they virtually had you captive in their chair. Highwaymen, of course, on the major roads of England. So there were a lot of perils getting to a dance, and I try to show something of that in my book as well.
Interesting. How about your Happily Ever After Celebrating Pride and Prejudice book? How did that come about? Just because it's that novel?
No. Well, it was the 200th anniversary coming up for Pride and Prejudice in the year 2013. And I wanted to share my joy in this novel with the rest of the world. So I thought, right, what better way to do that than to write a book about 200 years of the world's favourite novel? So I have things like looking at the translations of the novel, what happens to that amazing first sentence when you try to translate it into a different language. What happens to all sorts of aspects of the novel when you're putting it into a very different language, say an Asian language. So I had a chapter on translations. I look at the merchandise, which has been absolutely extraordinary for Pride and Prejudice, the sequels, prequels, adaptations, theatrical versions, musical versions. No other novel has had as many afterlives as Pride and Prejudice. But I also have a chapter on the heroine. Robert Louis Stevenson once commented that every single time Elizabeth Bennet opened her mouth and spoke, he wanted to fall to his knees and worship her. I've always loved that quote.
I didn't know that one. Yeah,
I've
never come across that. That's great.
So many of us just fall in love madly with Elizabeth Bennet, whether male or female. She's got incredible charm. Now, what I found so interesting was that other novelists will tell you their heroine is charming. Jane Austen never does that with Elizabeth. She just shows that charm operating in every page of the book. So we come away completely convinced that Elizabeth Bennet is charming without the author telling us that she is, just showing us so wonderfully. And charm, I think, is a very hard quality to capture in a character. I can't think of that many heroines from literature who are absolutely charming, but I think Elizabeth Bennet really is.
I agree. I find it interesting that in Emma, Austen as a narrator goes out of her way to tell us how wonderful Emma is, and yet we're being misled that not that she's bad, but that she herself is mistaken in so many things.
She's a much more faulty heroine, and I adore Emma. I have to agree with Mr. Knightley that Emma is faultless in spite of all her faults, but I don't think she has quite the same charm that Elizabeth Bennet has. And I also did a chapter on Mr. Darcy. What is it about Mr. Darcy that makes him the sort of ultimate sex symbol in literature? There was a group of scientists who were creating a pheromone, and they were sort of testing it out on mice and what made a female mouse particularly attractive to a male and vice versa. And at the end of the time, they'd come up with this masculine pheromone, and they needed to give it a name. So they named it after Mr. Darcy, because they couldn't think of anything more sexy, more wonderful, more appealing to the opposite sex than Mr. Darcy. So, and he's also a man who, throughout the novel, says very, very little. So I look at, is that a part of his sex appeal? In fact, most of his dialogue comes right at the end of the novel when he's actually engaged to Elizabeth. Before that, he is very much the strong and silent type, and we get very little dialogue from Darcy. He says a lot less than most of the other characters. So is his silence, again, a huge part of his appeal to readers? So I look at why it is that Darcy is just so sexy, so wonderful, such a marvelous hero of the novel. And I've got chapters on lots of the other characters and the afterlives of the novel. I've got a whole chapter on the opening sentence. Why has that become such a famous opening sentence? So really, the book Happily Ever After was my attempt to analyse what it is about Pride and Prejudice that makes it the world's favourite novel.
Well, we're doing all that in 28 weeks. So we're taking our time working.
And very well too.
Through that same question. Yeah. Speaking of Darcy, I found it interesting that on this read through, one thing I noticed is how frequently he smiles, and we're told that he's smiling through those first few chapters. Not the impression people have of him, but yet when you read carefully, he's amused or smiling because he said something frequently. I think he has the most smiles of anyone.
Yes.
Early.
And there's that lovely moment when Elizabeth is at Pemberley and she looks at his portrait and she sees such a smile on his face as she remembers to have seen, coming in her direction. And that, as you say, makes you think, oh, where has Darcy actually smiled? Where have the smiles been and why is he smiling? And those are very revealing moments.
They are. You had one more Austen book, and then is this all the Austen books you've had so far? The Jane and I, A Tale of Austen Addiction?
Well, I actually began with a tiny little book called Jane Austen Antipodean Views, which was a collection of contributions from famous Australians and New Zealanders about Jane Austen. Had they been forced to study her at the schoolroom? Did they love her novels? So I edited that book along with a friend of mine, Anne Harbers, and that book came out many years ago now, so it's perhaps slightly out of date when it comes to some of the contributors, but it was great fun to see just what part Austen plays right on the other side of the earth from where she was writing her novels and, 200 years after she wrote them. So that was fun to do. And then I wrote my little memoir, Jane and I, A Tale of Austen Addiction, in the year 2017. And that was to mark the bicentenary of Jane Austen's death. So again, I wanted to mark this very important and I think very moving date. She died way too early. We could have had another 6 wonderful novels to enjoy by writing my memoir to show just how Jane Austen had changed my life. And I say to people sometimes, reading Jane Austen has changed my life. And their eyebrows go up and they look a bit skeptical and they say, oh, really? And I explain that Jane Austen has given me my career as a public speaker and my position as president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia. It's thanks to Jane Austen I started running literary tours with Australians studying abroad. So I take tour groups to places connected with Jane Austen, as well as lots of other countries and famous writers. But it was Jane Austen who got me started on my tours. My love of Jane Austen has given me many of my best friends. I think even the way I've decorated my home with all sorts of books and Jane Austen merchandise around the place. Jane Austen has totally changed my life. So the memoir, it's just a short little book, was great fun to write. And it was my testament to the power of wonderful novels to really change human lives.
As this book does, and as I've heard from so many people coming on the show. So that's really wonderful. What can where can people find you online, and what do you have coming up?
Well, Google my name and you can see that I do all sorts of things literary, which are all lots of fun. I produce a monthly newsletter called Notes from a Book Addict. It's free, comes out on the first day of every month. So anybody can sign up for it on my website. And I give reading recommendations. I include a wonderful poem every month. I celebrate literary anniversaries. I talk about statues of writers or portraits of writers. All sorts of different things are in my newsletter. So if any of the viewers today would like to sign up for that, I'd be really delighted to have them involved.
Wonderful.
And then I've got lots of tours coming up. Sadly, none that go to any really direct Jane Austen places this year. I've got one in Scotland. Jane Austen mentions Scotland, particularly, of course, Gretna Green, but she never actually went there. But that's a gorgeous tour that includes, Burns, Sir Walter Scott, Stevenson, J.M. Barrie, Muriel Spark, Ian Rankin, all those wonderful Scottish writers.
Oh, boy.
I've got one to Scandinavia, which I'm very excited about. We go in the footsteps of Hans Christian Andersen, Ibsen, Astrid Lindgren, some of those great Scandi noir crime writers. So that's a lovely tour to do. And I do, but it's now fully booked, have an English tour. It's not my first English tour, which included Chawton, Bath and Lyme Regis. It's my second English tour, and this one includes Portsmouth. So we visit the Garrison Church, which of course the Price family goes to, all dressed in their Sunday best, and places connected with Mansfield Park in Portsmouth. But that's really the only Jane Austen connection on that particular tour. But again, the links to the tours are in my website, so anyone can join them, whether from Australia or from the States or Canada, wherever. So I'd love to have people join me on some of my what I think are fabulous literary tours.
Great.
So that's all keeping me very busy, Ed.
Yeah, we'll share your link. It sounds like a life I want to live. So well done.
Lots of fun.
Well, thank you so much for taking a turn about the room with us today, Susanna. It's been wonderful.
It's been delightful. Thank you, Ed, and thanks to all the viewers who have joined us here today. And keep up the good work with all of these Austen Mondays and whatever might come next after you have finished with Pride and Prejudice.
Thank you. All righty. I hope I'll see you again.
Great. Thanks, Ed.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Well, everyone, we have only 4 more Turnabout the Room guests coming up. There's only 5 shows left. Next week on February 20th, our Turnabout the Room guests will be Bridget Draxler and Danielle Spratt, 2 for the price of 1, authors of Engaging the Age of Jane Austen. And on February 27th, another 2-fer. That will be Lauren Weathers and Emily Davis Hale of the Reclaiming Jane podcast will join me. And then the 2 in March, on March 6th, we'll have Juliet Wells is actually going to return to talk about Emma. And then on March 13th, Claudia Johnson will finally be able to return after her first appearance had been canceled. So we'll see her on March 13th. And we won't have a Turnabout the Room segment on the final show on March 20th, just all 3 co-hosts and myself. So let me take this moment to thank all of you for watching this episode. As a nonprofit organization, the Rosenbach Museum and Library depends on the generosity of friends and supporters like you to keep programs like this free and accessible to hundreds of fellow Austen lovers worldwide. If you would like to donate to the Rosenbach, you can do so at our website. You could also become a member. Membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to member-only events. You can learn about how to become a member on our website as well. And at the end of every show, I give a shout out to all who have donated since our last show, including someone who donated from Australia. Lots of great in-person and virtual programs and courses at the Rosenbach coming up. The spring schedule will be announced soon. I gave you a sneak peek a couple weeks ago with the new Gothic Lit course, Gothic Transformations. That's going to be taught by the Ghoul Guides, Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. And there will also be a Jane Austen course following this show that will begin in April. Juliet Wells, who's going to come on the show on March 6th to talk about Emma, will be teaching a course on Emma that will meet 4 times over April and May, and we'll do it on Monday nights. It'll be a bi-weekly course every 2 weeks for 4 meetings, and it'll run the same time this show is running. So if you watch the show live, you'll be that's the times that we picked for the show to run. And it will be capped at 25 people, because it won't be like this. It won't just be a couple screens of people talking. You'll all be on it as well. So the 25 people and Juliet Wells and myself, because I'm not going to miss out on Juliet Wells and you guys, and great discussion about Emma. So don't look for it online now, because it's not there. It won't be available for registration for members until March. I'm off with the date now. It'll be after Juliet Wells is on the show, and then a week later, for members will be first, and then a week later, general public will be able to sign up. So another reason to become a member, you get first crack at registering for Rosenbach programs, and you also get 10% off. So benefits of a Rosenbach membership. Don't forget, my new Pickwick Monthly show begins on March 25th. I am so excited about that I have to share a picture of it again. And there it is. The Pickwick Monthly will be free to watch and will stream live on one Saturday a month for 20 months. On each episode of Pickwick Monthly, we talk about the Pickwick Papers, just as Dickens originally released it, monthly, 2-3 chapters at a time. And about 100 of you have already registered, which I found absolutely wonderful. And many of you also given donations alongside your registration for Pickwick Monthly. So thank you so much for that. I will be sure to thank all of you personally on our first show, March 25th. And Karen asked, let me welcome my co-host here, Kathleen. Hello, welcome.
Hello. How are we doing?
Good. Happy to have you here. I was just about, Pickwick Monthly will come up next month, which I get to talk about Dickens' Pickwick Papers. And Karen in the audience asked last week if I was going to be celebrating Dickens's birthday, which was on February 7th. And not only did I, but here I am celebrating at the Charles Dickens and Little Nell statue in Philadelphia, in Clark Park in Philadelphia. This used to be, for a while, this was the only statue of Dickens in the world. Now there's one in Australia. Well, the one in Australia was up, and then it was taken down for a while or broke or something, and then it's been restored. I think there's one in Portsmouth as well now. But this, for a long time, was the only Dickens statue in the world.
I was going to say, what a strange author to not have loads of statues of.
Well,
You'd think there'd be ones everywhere.
said he didn't want public memorials after he died, and his family kind of interpreted that as no statues.
Right.
So much so that when
as families do,
well, so much so that when this statue was made by Frank Ewell at the turn of the 20th century, he had it all ready to give to the family to send to England, and they said no, thank you. So it sat,
thank you.
It sat in a warehouse on the Philadelphia docks for a long time, and then finally it was donated to the parks in Philadelphia, and it wound up in a park here. And it's got
I love the very
Nell.
polite no thank you. It's a great statue though.
Yes.
It looks really great.
It is. It's little Nell looking up to him, and here I am. We celebrate there. We do readings there every year on his birthday, and here I am with this is Frank Chance here, who's always our MC, and in the middle there, that's Kevin Quinn, and Kevin will be one of the co-hosts, one of my rotating co-hosts on Pickwick Monthly. So that was my Dickens fun this year on Dickens's birthday.
Very excited for Pickwick Monthly. I haven't read that since college, and I'm very, very happy to get back into that.
Good. Well, it is a total blast. I absolutely love it. It's funny, and it's funny. Like
it
really
is
funny.
Yeah.
And I can't wait for that. So, all righty. And we have an Emma course coming up when the show ends.
Yes. Yeah. No, I'm very excited for that too.
You taught our last Austen course.
I did Sense and Sensibility. Yeah,
which was a lot of fun. So
it was amazing. Well, and everyone made it. Like it is great fun, and the participants make it. That's it. I think I learned more from everybody else than I ended up teaching anybody.
I know, and it's great to have them all here and have them all talking, and I get to hear all this that I don't usually get to hear, for the show. So I love it, and it's with Emma, which is such a fantastic novel,
perfect novel.
And to warm everybody up, our next weekly Biblioventure program, the weekly one following Austen Mondays, I'll announce on March 13th. That's when you find out what the next book will be in our weekly series. The show itself won't begin until September, but we'll announce it in the penultimate week of this show, what's going to be our next book. So
anticipation is building.
Yeah, I love to tease and
Yes.
hold it out for a long time.
Good way
that
to do
show, I'll hold it out for a long time before I announce it. Yes. So, well, every week I enjoy a cocktail inspired by the chapters we're reading. And today's drink is just the very simple Shandygaff, but I'm calling it the George and Lydia, which is Wickham's first name, George.
Yes.
People forget that sometimes. It's the George and Lydia. It's just half beer or ale. I used a winter lager. It's got a little spice in it too. And non-alcoholic ginger ale, ginger beer. I asked my wife to buy me some ginger beer, and she went to the store and just looked in the beer aisle, and I was like, no, but it's not. It's
not alcohol. No.
Aisle.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
ginger beer.
I'm sorry
beer.
I said that, but I did. I thought it was a simple, inexpensive drink for a couple who haven't had much money while hiding out in London. Sure, we know Wickham doesn't have any money.
No.
And they will not be drinking the finest vintages in the days to come.
They will not. They will not. I do love that what the equivalent of our Valentine's Day episode is this pairing. this terrible pairing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Equal parts joy and misery for Lydia. So there you go.
Yes.
Ooh.
Oh yes.
It's different drinking beer on the show. I have to make sure I don't belch on the air.
Right. Yeah.
All righty.
Well, I think you just got to time it so that whenever you do, it's insulting to Wickham. Like it's a sound. So yeah.
That's what it is. All righty. Well, for today's chapters, we are going to be talking about chapters 48 to 50, Lydia and the wickedest young man in the world, which is what he's called in the chapter.
Yes.
So, there you go.
And which he is, so it's fine.
And it's chapters 48 to 50 or volume 3, chapters 6 to 8, if you have a book that divides it in the way that Austen originally divided her book. We have just, Elizabeth has returned to Longbourn, and the family is still waiting to hear news of Lydia. They haven't really heard what's become of her yet. Her father's out tracking her down, and this is how it starts in chapter 48.
And I do love how again, the guest today and in the last episode, it's crime. Rereading it, I was like, God, this really does almost read like a murder mystery of where are they? And why have they done this? That it's so against, everyone's self-interest to do this, that it is a crime is incredible.
Well, Mr. Bennet's in London, and their whole family's waiting, and the whole party were in hopes of a letter from Mr. Bennet the next morning, but the post came in without bringing a single line from him. He is a most negligent and dilatory correspondent, but at such a time they had hoped for exertion. A little hint that
the bad sign, isn't it, in general? Yeah.
Mr. Bennet's not going to change.
No.
He is what he is, and this is the way he behaves.
Yeah. Even at the crisis point here.
I mean, Mr. Gardner is, he's just waiting to see if there's any letters. There's not. So he goes off, and it seems when he was gone, they were certain at least of receiving constant information from him, and and the fact that it seems like he'll be able to help. Like Mr. Bennet isn't going to be able to fix this situation, but perhaps Mr. Gardner will. He seems more capable than Mr. Bennet.
And again, to preview, he's going to seem more capable throughout this entire thing. So definitely stand-in dad there.
The aunts are the people are visiting. The other aunt visited as well. That's Mrs. Phillips, right? Yeah.
Yes, but was not helpful.
No.
More dispirited than she found them.
But yeah, they're more dispirited is how she leaves them. But it's interesting that Mrs. Phillip remarks on how everyone's coming up with all these stories of Wickham's extravagance and irregularity when he was there.
I found this very interesting because, again, I mean, we've talked before in classes and this for sure about the importance of gossip as something that's often ascribed to women as a not valued form of communication, but also one of the few forms of communication that are very much based in women's circles. But that it's an important as kind of a moderating force for a primarily patriarchal society, that, you know, how do women then influence it? Well, they do it through gossip. And rereading this, I thought it was really interesting that all Meryton was involved in this, but that it's really the tradespeople. There's a really interesting class divide here, where it's not only gossip, which is a woman's thing, but it's also not servants, but a working class group. He was declared to be in debt to every tradesman in the place, and his intrigues, all honored with the title of seduction, and be extended into every tradesman's family. So that there's this double, he doesn't pay his debts, and there's also the implication of sexual impropriety extending towards a group of people which seem to have less protection than their employer or the consumer class. That the implication of that all the tradesmen knew this, but no one bothered to ask them, of all the trouble that it's that old joke of, see how people act around waiters, and you'll get their true character. That there has been this entire alternative world of communication, which, Austen is very viciously aware of, that there's the world of the drawing room, and then there's the world outside of the drawing room, and that world is an entirely separate but also codependent ecosystem. And that world knows exactly who Wickham is.
Well, did they know it at the time, or do they not know it until he leaves?
Yeah,
and
I mean that's
behind?
yeah.
I mean, Wickham is able to fool them to a point.
Yeah.
And then when he leaves, they realize, wait a minute, he never paid us.
Yeah. Well, that's I think that's, again, it's implied trick of did they know, or is it just now being acknowledged? Is either one, but that it seems that most of the basis, again, it's a twofold basis, which is, one is sexual impropriety, two is money. And you can maybe do one or the other, but you can't have both. You can't be falling in both camps there. You got to pay your debts one way or another.
Yeah, and everybody now has declared him to be the wickedest young man in the world. And Frances has a question here. She said, would it count these days as kidnapping since she's underage, even though she went willingly? Ignore it. Yeah, of course it would today. Then it doesn't. And it really doesn't. And it is only the family who could bring, a kind of a suit against him. But they're more, because she is already, she's 15, they're already thinking that they just need to fix the situation or hush it up. That it's not
kind of along the same lines of when they're in a formal engagement and one party reneges on the the male party that's a legal issue. There are 10,000 different legal issues, but I don't think kidnapping, because I just don't think that would have fit into they had 10 million other things to bring against them, but I'm not sure we obviously would very much consider it.
But
something.
no one's going to, he's not going to get prosecuted, because any judge at that time would just say the girl went with him, except if it was an influential family, and then you can punish people. So.
I love everybody declared that he was the wickedest young man in the world. And also everyone had always distrusted the appearance of his goodness. Everyone, 201.
Yes, this is what we get. So we got immediately from Mrs. Bennet, how she never liked him. And of course she did love him, and they all did. And now they're thinking that, now they're all now they all believed what they wanted to believe before, and now
I didn't trust his face. I hated his face, didn't trust his looks.
It's interesting that Mr. Gardner asks Elizabeth about, because they're trying to track him down. And before he goes, he asks her this, he's like, perhaps you know something about Wickham's relations.
And it's an interesting thing too. Again, it does set up this whole structure of it's soldiers versus civilians. They are going to ask his friends, but they don't seem to have a whole lot of faith that anyone else in the regiment is basically going to rat him out. Which for a country at wartime to really be like, oh, well, soldiers, and they're not going to expose, they're on Wickham's side in this. And if you want information, you're going to have to look a little bit elsewhere. That Colonel Foster can't keep him in line, that all, it's a very interesting, I think, kind of war commentary there. But it very pointed to, perhaps Lizzie could tell us what relations he has now living better than any other person.
Yeah.
What a
well, it's a reminder that for everyone else, and especially the Gardners, she's paired with him. They thought they were that she, I mean, she did too. I mean, she was very interested in him, and he showed that he was interested in her. And so it's a reminder to us that in other eyes of the other characters, they were seen as a potential couple. And some of them thought that they would definitely be
quite extreme, I would think too. I mean, again, I almost think a little bit pushing the boundary of propriety a little, and I feel like that was hinted earlier in earlier chapters when, Elizabeth said too much to Wickham. She wasn't as guarded in the things that she said, and obviously he wasn't particularly guarded in what he said to her, but that there is almost this edge of danger for Elizabeth, and obviously that's exploded now, because there was real danger this entire time, that the cautionary tale of Lydia could also be the cautionary tale of Elizabeth.
And the number of, tete-a-tetes that people witnessed between Wickham and Elizabeth, in different circumstances. And, so she's the one they turn to. She knows nothing, of course. She only knows what Darcy has told her about him. And what she knows that Wickham has said, she wouldn't know if any of it's true yet anyway. So and you get another Austen thing that, she was at no loss to understand from whence this deference for her authority proceeded, but it was not in her power to give any information of so satisfactory a nature as the compliment deserved. It's not a compliment, it's not deference, it's actually a little bit embarrassing that you're the person who could maybe point us to where this rat is hiding. Where's the wickedest man in the world? You must
know. Elizabeth would know. Lizzie's the Wickham expert.
So, well, now we get this. A letter arrives for their father from a different quarter, from Mr. Collins.
It's one of those, I remember just being wild about it when I first read it. And I always seem to forget that it's there. And then I reread it and I'm like, wow.
I feel myself called upon by our relationship and my situation in life to condole with you on the grievous affliction you are now suffering under, which he has discovered. I sympathize with you and all your respectable family. This must be the bitterest kind of distress, because proceeding from a cause which no time can remove. and then the wonderful, condoling, advice that the death of your daughter would have been a blessing in comparison of this.
Which is a really interesting, again, kind of thing that it's a common thing in romance literature and literature of this period, sentimental literature of this period anyway, that Austen lampoons in several of her novels, that this idea of transgressive woman must be killed, because that's the formula. That's the sentimental formula, is woman transgresses, she must die in a suitably dramatic manner. I mean, that's almost what happens to Marianne in Sense and Sensibility. She makes that emotional mistake, and then she catches a fever. So that as night must follow the day, death must follow. The social death that's committed by. But don't say it, man. The death of your daughter, a blessing.
No, and this is the letter that really paints him in his blackest light. That he is. Yeah. We know,
and Charlotte too. I'm very disappointed in Charlotte.
Well, Well, we know Collins is ridiculous. We know that he's selfish. And then this and fawning and but this is where it really paints him in the worst possible
This is
light.
cruel. Yeah.
But you're right that about Charlotte. My dear Charlotte informs me that this licentiousness of behavior in your daughter has proceeded from a faulty degree of indulgence. Well, that's my question. Is it Charlotte that really told him? He also says,
or did he just make that assumption and Charlotte just sort of went, dear?
Well, it says he was informed by a letter from Hertfordshire. So what he did is he got a letter from the Lucases that said that this had happened. And I imagine he's the one then, or maybe it's not him. It's a letter from the Lucases probably to Charlotte, and then she has to share the news. So that's the only informing thing I think here. But did Charlotte say that, oh, well, of course, Lydia ran away because this is her behavior? And
I mean, it's certainly, I feel like that's what he implies, because there's reason to suppose, as my dear Charlotte informed me, that this licentiousness of behavior in your daughter has proceeded from a faulty degree of indulgence. It how he phrases it does make it sound, but again, we know that Collins projects a lot. So it could just be he's mulling over the news without editorialization from Charlotte, and he's saying, do you think it's the parents' fault, or do you think she's just naturally a bad person? And Charlotte may just be, completely off somewhere else, just going, oh yes, dear, sure.
Well, but Charlotte's going to give the realistic answer that the Bennet sisters themselves give. They're like, oh my gosh, this is a horrible thing, and and Elizabeth and Jane, well, Jane not so much, but Elizabeth knows that Lydia never should have gone to there in the first place.
I mean, she's not incorrect. But it was just one of those things that I read, and I'm like, it would be hard not to read that as a betrayal on some level, or at the very least, Charlotte aligning herself more fully with Mr. Collins than she does with her old friends.
Well, however, Mr. Collins says, the worst possible thing, though, is that Lady Catherine knows, and of course to whom I've related the affair, and they agree with him in apprehending that this false step in one daughter will be injurious to the fortunes of all the others, for who, as Lady Catherine herself condescendingly says, will connect themselves with such a family. So that's and of course this comes from Lady Catherine, that this is the opinion that really counts. And it's not that Lady Catherine's wrong.
No.
This
and again, it's not that it's not even that what he said previously about, is it bad parenting, or is Lydia just a bad person? It's not that is necessarily wrong either, but it's not, the point of the entire letter, as he basically says himself at the end, it leads me, moreover, to reflect with augmented satisfaction on a certain event of last November. For had it been otherwise, I must have been involved in all your sorrow and disgrace. This entire letter is a self-congratulatory letter that he managed to avoid getting any more entangled with either the bad parents or the just bad daughters. And because, anyone connected to this now obviously must suffer for it.
Yes. And he would have been it would not have been good for him to have married a Bennet daughter and then have this happen to the family in Lady Catherine's eyes.
So someone dodged a bullet there.
Well, but that's okay. Well, and he gives the final advice here, as any charitable, forgiving Christian,
yes,
to throw off your unworthy child from your affection forever and leave her to reap the fruits of her own heinous offense.
He's dear. Yes, fling all invectives at Mr. Collins now.
He's the worst. He's the worst.
The worst. Yes, scrolling back, your proposal was the worst. I know we were debating whether or not you had the worst proposal, but I retract anything. You're the worst. And again, you're a figure of fun, but you're also weirdly a figure of authority. And that this letter is what you produce is, as with so many Austen things, it cuts even as you laugh at it, because it's it's harsh, and it's a definite political social commentary there.
This man has power over his parishioners. This
Mhm.
man is, in charge of their spiritual welfare. This is the man that will give advice to the families of his parish about things that they may do or things that they may happen to them. And this is the kind of
what he comes up with. Yeah.
So, well, they find out more about Wickham now from Colonel Forster. They find out that he left gaming debts behind.
A gamester.
A gamester, she cried.
Jane.
That Jane heard
wholly unexpected, says Jane. Jane, the person for whom this is wholly unexpected.
Jane, he ran away with your sister and did not marry her. A gamester is not the horror here.
No. Next, we're going to hear that he kicked a puppy once, and she's just gonna not cope. No coping.
So, yeah, she couldn't handle that. But now,
again, too, that everyone kind of knew this, and that it was an open secret, but then it wasn't, and that it's all coming out is yeah.
And they learn all this. They learn this about from Forster, from actually a letter from Mr. Gardner, and he says that he's going to stay and search, and he's going to send Mr. Bennet home, which of course causes Mrs. Bennet to be concerned that who is to fight Wickham and make him marry her if he comes away.
I don't want him to fight him, but I do want him to fight him.
You must fight him. I mean,
that's how it works.
She really is disconnected from reality in this. And normally it would be a situation where you think like, oh, well, the trauma of something really bad happening might cause you to disconnect, but she's just disconnected.
Yeah. Well, that's it. She's got her
highlight them, here.
Yeah. She and again, that's revealed later, not to jump ahead, but she just got her rules about how things work, and that how they work is how they work in a romantic novel. Yeah. And how they work is how they appear to be, as opposed to how things really are. You have to have the correct clothes, but do the morals have to stand up with it? You have to duel, but the natural kind of practicalities of that, we're not going to worry about that.
The next paragraph is, as Mrs. Gardner began to wish to be at home. I wonder why.
Mrs. Gardner, who has performed above and beyond the call of duty for the entirety of the novel,
she's there
be
with
released
her
now back home.
I mean, this has got to be really difficult for her to have to deal with Mrs. Bennet this whole time.
Yeah.
Elizabeth now, we get another kind of self-reflective moment from her here, right?
And for Mrs. Gardner too, because Mrs. Gardner expects a letter.
Yes.
For Elizabeth from her Derbyshire friend. And when that is not forthcoming, she notices. Yeah. Notices.
And Elizabeth had received none. And of course, and the receiving the letter is an important point. I think I can't remember, one of the annotated books, maybe in the Harvard, points out that what she's hinting at here is that the only reason Elizabeth could get a letter from a man would be if they were engaged. And so what Mrs. Gardner is thinking is that maybe there's more to Elizabeth and Darcy, and that Darcy would have sent her a letter and he hasn't, which means that they're not engaged. And because Mrs. Gardner has already told her she's not going to push Elizabeth, she's not going to ask. And again, that everyone assumes Elizabeth is the Wickham expert. Yeah. Because it's Wickham she prefers, but Aunt Gardner, she sees, she knows what's up. So Elizabeth was by this time tolerably well acquainted with her own feelings, was perfectly aware that had she known nothing of Darcy, she would have borne the dread of Lydia's infamy somewhat better. It would have spared her, she thought, one sleepless night out of two. The fact that, that she knows that Darcy knows has made it all worse for her. That she had that brief moment of maybe this could happen with Darcy, and it was so quickly.
And instead, every kind of negative thing he's ever said about her family has been reinforced now.
What she defended, what she, was all those things that he accused her family of. This is
and which she fought back against and tried to defend against. No.
Well, Mr. Bennet comes home and
Philosophic as ever.
who should suffer but myself? It has been my own doing, and I ought to feel it. Elizabeth tries to, don't. And he says, no, let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame. I am not afraid of being overpowered by the impression. It will pass away soon enough.
He knows who he is.
Responsibility, but then still makes a joke about it,
Yeah. And again, is self-critical. He knows this isn't going to necessarily change him fundamentally.
Because his outlook on life is always, it's to laugh at the folly of the world while he retreats from it. So here now, another bad thing has happened in the world, even though it connects to him. Still, what he does, his suffering is not going to be extreme. He is just going to retreat from it again. That's the way he lives his life as the country gentleman.
Yeah, and if he can torture Kitty a bit too, more the better.
Julia asks, without marrying Lydia, does Wickham ruin his reputation as well as hers? Yes, but only,
but not the same level.
I mean, if other well-established gentry families or even wealthy families know he's done this, they may not let him marry their daughters, but certainly the men in this society they're not going to care.
He can still make a living. Whereas the implication is there's no one required to give Lydia a living if she's thrown out into the, there's no depth to which Lydia can sink that's too far. Whereas bottom line is, Wickham can always still earn a living somewhere. So while his reputation may take a hit and he may not be invited to as many parties, fundamentally his survival.
It would only be some people that wouldn't. Yeah, it would only be some people who wouldn't invite him. And others certainly would, because it's the kind of the standard for morality.
And again, it's a patriarchy, which means that men are to a certain extent insulated from the consequences of this, and we see it again in other Austen books like Willoughby. Again, in Sense and Sensibility, who is basically insulated from what he does by wealth and privilege, and men who will not call him out on it. So,
Colonel Brandon does, but that's all he does. Brandon has a private duel with him. Nobody gets killed, and then that's it. Brandon has satisfied the rules of what the men are supposed to do, and now Willoughby's can just go off and do what he wants. It's not like Brandon tries to sue him or
it's a performative honor display that really has no effect on the women whatsoever. The consequences for Lydia are much more severe.
I mean, think of the only consequences for Willoughby is just that he's all upset about
his man pain, the pain.
Always going to be sad now.
Of course, he gets out. Willoughby doesn't have to then marry Lydia, so there's that silver lining. So,
Mr. Bennet also praises Lizzie. I bear you no ill will for being justified in your advice to me last May, which, considering the event, shows some greatness of mind. The fact that he recognizes that you were right, and I need to say that.
Yeah, you won't say I told you so, so I will say you told me so.
Yeah. And now poor Kitty gets it. I'm not going to run away. Don't worry, Dad. And he's like, you're not going to run away.
You're going nowhere, kiddo.
I'm not letting you out of the house. No balls, no officers, nothing.
Until you have spent 10 minutes of every day in a rational manner.
Yeah. So
low bar.
10 years.
If you're a good girl for the next 10 years, I will take you to a review at the end of them.
So again, it's his kind of joking side that he's still not taking this as seriously,
terribly seriously,
characters. Or you can argue that it's just his philosophical outlook. It's like, well, what's the point of crying about
getting too crazy about it
when it's happened, that there's nothing we can do except go on with our lives as we're doing it? But he has the luxury and the privilege of doing that as the man, and he can go off and study and do whatever he wants.
And has through the entire text. Again,
Yep.
you know, the entail and what's going to happen to these women after he's gone. That's an issue, but it's not really an issue for him. And he doesn't go out of his way to, you know, make provisions or correct that. So, you know, this is very much par for the course.
Well, next chapter, we get a servant sighting here, some lines and all, from Hill, Mrs. Hill, the housekeeper.
Oh, yeah.
When she comes up and Jane Elizabeth outside, and she says, you know, there's a letter come from Mr. Gardner, and Mr. Bennet's been reading
He's
it.
had it for half an hour. You didn't know?
Yeah.
I know.
Again, but another instance of the servants know things in this house or can infer things, and sometimes they will know it before other people in the family.
Yeah, absolutely.
They go and find out. Mr. Bennet, who's walking around outside, gives it to them, and the letter is from Mr. Gardner that Lydia and Wickham have been discovered, and they are not married, or can I find their
despite Jane's hopes? Yeah.
Being so, yeah.
Yeah.
But he says, if you're willing to perform the engagements which I have ventured to make on your side, I hope it will not be long before they are married. Her, and all that it's going to cost is her equal share of the £5,000 secured among your children after the decease of yourself and my sister, which is what they would have gotten anyway. And then, but also during his life, £100 a year he has to give to Wickham and Lydia. He also says that he says, Mr. Wickham's circumstances are not so hopeless as they're generally believed to be. The world has been deceived in that respect. There's been some little money, and even with all his debts discharged, he's still going to have a little left over from that. Like, what?
Yeah. The world has been deceived, but not the way you think it has.
Yeah, it's, you know, none of it, you know, seems to work with everything that we've discovered so far, and we'll find out later chapters that Mr. Gardner's
and
not
again that
telling
this
the
whole thing does have the air of a murder mystery, in that you can see from the moment it starts that this was completely unexpected. Something else is going on here, that he picks on Lydia when there's really, he loses out on an heiress, a proper heiress. He picks up on Lydia. Lydia has nothing. It's not in his self-interest. And then he has debts, and now he has fewer debts than we thought he did. Or does he? Yeah, she does it. She should have written murder mysteries, Austen, because she would have been very good at some of these.
Kristen had a question here too. She said, were the tradesmen's daughters also ruined, or were the rules different between classes? I'm sorry, Kristen, rules are always different between classes.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, they would have been ruined, but in a way that would not have affected, it probably wouldn't have affected their families as much as it is with this gentry class.
But when you, again, are already in a position where you would have to be working anyway, it's not that much of a shift.
Yeah.
You know, pregnancy obviously would have made a difference. But again, you're already in that area. You're already in the kind of the trade area. So you didn't have that much further to go. And, you know, for women of a certain class, there's almost nothing worse than having to live in a small place and do work, like sewing work to support yourself. And also the line between respectable work. So yeah, consequences, but not the same, not quite the same thing.
Yeah. And it's not, there's already that kind of, you know, moral difference that the upper classes feel for the lower classes, that they don't have to, like, if you're in trade, it doesn't really matter. What you do doesn't matter nearly as much as what this other group does. But within that group himself, within that, you know, kind of middle class or working class, I think that they have other things. They have different things to worry about.
And I think too, it's just a feudal hangover. Aristocrats don't consider them as valuable. So, you know, they can't be ruined in the same way because it's not the same standard. So, you know, the expectation that you are going to perhaps sow your wild oats within a class of people who can't fight back in the same way, you know, that's just, unfortunately, yes, that's you know, kind of between the lines of literature of this period. is the recognition that, many people of the working classes were sexually exploited simply because they could be, because they had no recourse for it. Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah.
Especially servants. I mean,
Yes. Yeah.
Byron, sleeps with every chambermaid as soon as he checks
into
the place.
And the whole premise of Richardson's Pamela is that, well, she's a servant, so of course I have sexual access to her whenever I, need to.
Double standard is there, and it works between classes as well. Elizabeth, when she hears this, she's like, is it possible? Can it be possible that he will marry her? And Jane's response is, Wickham is not so undeserving as we have thought.
Jane. My sweet summer child, no.
And then Elizabeth says to her father, and they must marry, yet he is such a man. But they have to marry, or Lydia is ruined and can never marry, and the family will be disgraced. But it's Wickham that she has to marry. And
well, again, Austen is so aware of the ridiculousness of this entire thing, which is he has been revealed in every sense of the word to be the worst kind of person to marry. And yet somehow they're going to marry, and then it's all going to be fixed. That's the implication is, oh yeah, you just perform a ceremony and then all of a sudden it's all fixed. But that doesn't change who Wickham is or what's happened.
Because Mr. Bennet doesn't think, oh my gosh, my daughter has to be married to this horrible man. He thinks, how much money did it cost my brother-in-law?
And this is sisterly love, and fatherly love, because they estimate Lydia's worth to be very low because she needs a lot of money for anyone to reasonably marry her.
He's a fool if he takes her with a farthing less than 10,000 pounds. And that's what he assumes must be the price that, is given. It's probably less.
How much do I have to pay this man to take her off my hands?
But that's he's for Mr. Bennet, I guess also for Mr. Bennet, the kind of morality issue has already been resolved in that she's already bad. Like people are already going to are already going to suspect her morals right off the bat. Now it's just a matter of, can she salvage a life? And she can now, and it's how much is it costing? They
assume it's her uncle who's done their uncle who's done this.
And Mr. just as I think a reader should be, Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth too are like incredulous, like, wait a minute, this can't be true. He must put out some money for this to make this happen.
And Wickham couldn't have possibly expected this much money from us. And what's going on here?
Not according to Jane, though. He certainly would not marry Lydia if he had not a real regard for her. He keeps coming out with these lines.
I would like to think so. I mean,
head shaking line. That's got to be the Elizabeth is just constantly.
Yes, yeah. Have you met Lydia? Yeah. I mean, it's. I'm always resistant to the narrative of bad girl is punished by bad marriage, and you'd like to think that maybe the generous Jane is on to something here, which is there has to be another reason why Wickham married her that wasn't just a long con, but also Jane, no, honey, he's a gangster.
Yeah. And we had that letter that Lydia had written to Mrs. Forster, the Colonel's wife, and how selfish she was about all of this. So it's even harder to have sympathy for Lydia in this position when Lydia has been completely kind of
ridiculous about it
and doesn't see, but clearly this is the way she was brought up. She wasn't given any real education.
Well, and Elizabeth says she's probably with the Gardners now. By this time she is actually with them. If such goodness does not make her miserable now, she will never deserve to be happy. She really ought to be ashamed. And if she isn't ashamed, she doesn't deserve to be happy, basically. she really does need to develop some kind of sense of some kind of moral something, because it just doesn't seem to be clicking there.
Well, the biggest part about it is the selfishness, is that, she is only concerned with her own welfare, her own happiness.
Yeah.
And she can't even,
and short-term happiness, not even really in the long term.
Just as Mrs. Bennet can't see that in this kind of situation how it harms the other girls, it's only about themselves.
Yeah, and she's thrilled, delightful indeed.
The joy burst forth. She is to know that her daughter would be married was enough. She was disturbed by no fear for her felicity, nor humbled by any remembrance of her misconduct. She just,
and the refocus, the clothes, the wedding clothes.
Yeah,
I will write to my sister Gardner about them directly. It's that reality versus whatever's going on in her head, and for her the most important thing is the clothes. We'll do the clothes. That's it.
Jane had said earlier, we must endeavor to forget all that has passed on either side. Mutual affection will steady them. And Mrs. Bennet's like, yeah, I've forgotten it already. They're going to be married. So
what happened?
All that counts. Dear Wickham, dear Wickham too. And then the wedding clothes, how merry we shall be together when we meet. Mrs. Bennet, this is when I find her no longer funny. This is when I find her to just be insufferable. That we know how selfish she is and a kind of narrow-minded she is. And Austen herself as a narrator is constantly making a joke about that. But everything's revolving around her comfort now in such a way that it's just tough to bear. I don't know how these people can bear it. I mean, I will go to Meryton as soon as I'm dressed and tell the good news to my sister Phillips, and I'll call on Lady Lucas and Mrs. Long, and
also the dismissal of the Gardners. If he had not had a family of his own, I and my children must have had all his money, And it is the first time we have ever had anything from him except a few presents. It's such a tone deaf, again, especially coming after the discussion with Mr. Bennet about how much money must have been spent. It's so tone deaf.
So callous that, her brother fixed all this and spent money on it. And she's like, well, why shouldn't he? And her reasoning that if he hadn't had kids, you would have gotten it all anyway. Well, he did have kids.
Yeah, he did have kids. And it's not like he didn't. He literally just took Elizabeth with them on a trip. It's not like he hasn't given them things. It's not.
He's taking money away from his own children for yours.
Mm-hmm. So. And this whole, we'll settle it later. Oh, but the servants shall get a bowl of punch. So yay us.
Well, Mrs. Hill's happy. So
it's a joy.
She hears, she's happy. All righty. Chapter 50.
More self-reflection for Mr. Bennet.
Yeah. And again, it's about his money. He's not,
and his lack of foresight in it,
not reflecting on the education of his daughters and how, on the money that has led to everything, and realizing that yes, he should have provided better provision for his children, but also he's not even going to suffer financially after all this is over. £100 a year, he figures, I was spending £100 a year on Lydia easily.
Mm-hmm. I may be spending less on her now, somehow. Yeah, it really does undermine this whole idea of benevolent paternalism, which, again, Austen lampoons every chance she gets. She always sets up these, ridiculous law, jaundice type twisted inheritance clauses, again, like in things like Sense and Sensibility. And here are these patriarchs who are supposed to benevolently take care of everyone around them, including the women in their family, including servants, including everything else. And they simply don't. And there are no consequences for them when they don't. Mm-hmm. And you really wish someone would learn a lesson or evolve or suffer a consequence. And they so rarely do.
Because it's very easy, especially I think on the first time reading this novel, especially because Mrs. Bennet starts it off about all the girls getting married and her behavior, that it seems as if it's all the fault of Mrs. Bennet and how these girls are. And it's actually Mr. Bennet bears not only as much, but especially in this system here, he bears more responsibility.
Yeah. And you can't even read Mrs. Bennet as as a reaction to him, because of course they need to be married because there's no other option.
And even with money, it says at this one paragraph, Mrs. Bennet had no turn for economy, though she certainly wasn't going to help with saving any money. And her husband's love of independence had alone prevented their exceeding their income. That he's just as to blame. For the financial situation that they are in.
And that he's still looking at it in terms of how can peace be bought for me, a very selfish peace where I don't have to be concerned about this, and what's the cheapest price I can get for it. There's still this very pointed, I think, lack of, he had never supposed that could Wickham be prevailed upon to marry his daughter. It would be done with so little convenience to himself as by present arrangement. Again, it's still that convenience. He hasn't learned anything.
Well, we finally get his chief wish at present was to have as little trouble in the business as possible, and he naturally returned to all his former indolence. So, situation's over. Now I'm just going to be in the study reading my books, and clearly, and clearly, you can all still just fend for yourselves when I die. I'm not going to bother to try to fix this situation at all.
Does draw a line that he doesn't want crossed. Well, yes. 2 lines really. Two lines, one of which he stays hard and fast with, and the other of which he does waffle it a bit.
While Mrs. Bennet is thinking, what house are they going to live in? What estate?
Hay Park,
the great house at Stoke, but the drawing room is not large enough. Like she's just delusional to think that this is going to happen with Lydia and Wickham. She thinks it's going to be an ordinary marriage, and not only ordinary, but on the level that her marriage was with Mr. Bennet,
if not higher, really, because she's talking about lodges and great houses in Stoke and.
But Mr. Bennet comes up with the one condition that into one. Actually, he waits till the servants are gone. He leaves her talk till the servants are gone. As soon as the servants are gone, he says, into one house in this neighborhood they shall never have admittance. I will not encourage the impudence of either by receiving them at Longbourn. Well, that's what Mr. Collins would have done. So really, am I supposed to be on your side here, Mr. Bennet? Are you just going to, take Mr. Collins' advice at this point of the game?
So there's that. And also Mrs. Bennet found with amazement and horror that her husband would not advance a guinea to buy clothes for his daughter. So he can't come into the house. And probably most shockingly to Miss Bennet, no clothes. No money for clothes.
Yeah, that's more shocking for her.
Yes, yeah. And, it's such a good line. She was more alive to the disgrace which the want of new clothes must reflect on her daughter's nuptials than to any sense of shame at her eloping and living with Wickham a fortnight before they took place. Again, it's just not lining up. It's all appearance and of the most superficial kind versus substance, and the morality of it, that she has no shame about this, but she has shame about the clothes.
Insufferable. My only answer for Mrs. Bennet by this point. Elizabeth's actually sorry that she had mentioned to Darcy, like, oh, well, now they're going to be married. Maybe I shouldn't have said it, but come on. It's not like it wouldn't help her anyway, right? Darcy's never going to marry into a family that includes
with this kind of imputation on it. Yeah.
That,
she
realizes this too, that he'd never connect himself with us. So
it's another one of those things though, where she's done this before and she's doing it now, which is she's assuming that she knows what Darcy thinks. And that's a mistake she's made in the past, and she is better, but she's still making, she has shifted very much, in that I think she certainly sees the position of Darcy from the proposal, where she now has a more circumspect view of herself, of her family. But her worst fears are informing her of what she believes Darcy thinks.
Yeah.
And whether or not that's reality, again, she's getting there, but she's not quite there yet. She is sure that he is, rejoicing, basically.
Yeah.
In what a triumph for him. Could he know that the proposals which he had proudly spurned only 4 months ago would now have been gladly and gratefully received? She's still kind of giving him, not the benefit of the doubt and describing the worst possible feelings to him, I think unfairly.
But she's also realizing about herself that she figures he must be relieved that she turned him down, but also the irony of now that she does want him and now she can't have him, and that's hitting her. Yeah,
she was humbled, she was grieved, she repented, though she hardly knew of what. She became jealous of his esteem when she could no longer hope to be benefited by it. She wanted to hear of him when there seemed the least chance of gaining intelligence. And I do love this too, that she really gets that he's her match. She began now to comprehend he was exactly the man who in disposition and talents would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was a union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness, his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she must have received benefit of greater importance. Again, that we're different, but we would have just clicked and brought out the best in each other. But alas.
Exactly. He is exactly the man for her. That's her realizing that she is totally in love with him. This is, she found the one.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and that not only
the one already,
and that not only, even if Lydia's marriage had been honorable, she still would have been married to Wickham, and there is no way that Darcy would ever put himself in a position where he was family to Wickham. So not just the manner of the marriage, but the marriage itself. There's no way. She
has this line here too, where she imagines Wickham and Lydia now being together, and then she imagines how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than her virtue. She could easily conjecture. Why could she easily conjecture that? Because she watched it with her parents. So she watched a couple brought together where their passions were stronger than their virtue and their desire to be sensible.
The short-term pleasure versus the long-term. And again, that the thing that the reason why her and Darcy would have clicked would be because they would have encouraged virtue in each other. They would have made each other better. But
well, they get another note from Mr. Gardner, and he says he gives them the final details that Wickham's going to quit the militia, and he has the promise of an ensigny in General whoever's regiment, now quartered in the north. Another thing that had to be paid for.
So he'd basically be a regular, yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, that is okay. So an ensigny is not a commission then. It's not something you would buy. Okay.
No,
all right.
No, but you're a regular in the army. So in a way, I think
into
it's
the
a little
regulars,
bit more
not
solid.
The militia. Yeah. He could go off and fight Napoleon now. So
yes, yeah. It does feel a little bit more like the army proper instead of the army that's here to do the parades through town.
So Mrs. Bennet is so upset now. Oh my gosh, they're in the north. We'll never get to see them.
This woman's a roller coaster ride from start to finish.
And such a pity she should be taken from a regiment where she was acquainted with everybody and had so many
the officers might not be so pleasant in General so-and-so's regiment. The officers aren't supposed to be pleasant. She's married
Mrs.
now.
Forster will miss her, and just my gosh. Well, anyway, the chapter ends with Jane and Elizabeth convincing Mr. Bennet that he has to let her come home, that even if it's just for the sake of what people like, they would be in worse position in society.
Just the last thing to paper this over. Yeah.
That, they need to at least come home. and that he sends word to his brother-in-law that she can come to Longbourn after they're married. Elizabeth,
and again, it's permission to come, not invitation to come. So.
Yeah. And look, because Elizabeth even wonders at the end, like she was surprised that Wickham should consult to such a scheme. Like, really? Wickham's going to come and face us?
Yeah. Wickham's a very interesting, again, I think, cipher character in this, because for so much of the book, his motivations are so opaque and even now, why he does what he does, why he consents to certain things, that he manages to escape even Elizabeth's searing insights like Darcy does.
How bold he is, and after doing this, then we'll be like, sure, let's go meet your family and we'll see what happens with that. But it's he has no shame.
Nope, none.
What he does. So.
He's returning to the town where he's known as the wickedest man in the world.
Yeah,
that's some cojones right there, right. One way or another.
All right. On that note, we'll leave it. J Knights, thank you all for tuning in today. Thanks to our show sponsor, Lisa Washington. Thanks to all of you who have donated or joined as members over the last week. Your support helps us bring this show to everyone, create other one-of-a-kind programs and courses, and also helps us care for our collections at the Rosenbach. I want to thank Doris W. from Leonia, New Jersey. Hi, Doris. I have Doris and take some of our courses. Judy C. from Raleigh, North Carolina, donated. And Larissa B. from Sydney, Australia. So thank you, Larissa, for donating. Many of you have also joined as Rosenbach as members. Rosenbach membership gives you free museum admission, discounts on programs and courses, and exclusive invitations to members-only events. So thank you for everyone has joined as members since the beginning. It really is true that this show wouldn't exist without your support. And a reminder for everybody that you can still register for Pickwick Monthly on our website. I'll be starting that next month on March 25th after the show has ended. Remember, we have an Austen Mondays Facebook group where you can continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. But right now, as you're watching this video, if you want to go down on the Rosenbach's YouTube account and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and feel free to leave comments there as well. All that helps us gain greater visibility. Thanks to Brianna, who was our chat, Mrs. Reynolds, for managing the links in our chat. Thanks to Susanna Fullerton for joining us from Australia to take a turn about the room. Join us on our next episode when Bridget Draxler and Danielle Spratt, authors of Engaging the Age of Jane Austen, will take a turn about the room with me, and Casey McMillan will come back as the annotation co-host. Casey McMillan will make a triumphant return for Lydia's triumphant return in chapters 51 and 52. Thank you, Kathleen, always.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure.
Great, thank you. Thanks to Tucker Christine, who wrote our opening and closing credits music. Thanks to my daughter, Lulu, who shot and created the credits with me. Farewell, readers. May Lady Catherine never wish to connect herself to your family. Bye-bye, everyone. Boom. There we go. Bye-bye.